Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We're most pleased to welcome you to today's program, and we have a historical topic today, the Buffalo Soldiers. It's a very rich part of our history, and we are so pleased to welcome to our program Mr. Albert Wilkerson, who's a very, very gifted individual on history, and also he is sure in role-playing today. We call this the Chautauqua format, and he's going to portray Top Sergeant Wilkie from the 1880s. And so keeping that in mind, Sergeant, welcome to the program, and we're pleased to go back in time and to have you tell this really remarkable story about this very special historical topic. Welcome.
Thank you.
To our show in the 1880s.
In the 1880s, yes.
And I'm so pleased to have two panelists going back with us in history. First of all is Erna Reinhardt, who is the Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. And as our guest panelist today, we're very pleased to welcome Charla Chittick, who is a member of the faculty in history and a very, very gifted member of our faculty. And welcome to both of you. And we shall invite Erna Reinhardt to take us back to the 1880s.
Welcome, Sergeant Wilkerson, to our program today, and this promises to be a great show. We understand that you are a member of the 9th Cavalry, and tell us what the 9th Cavalry was.
Well, the 9th Cavalry was a horse unit in the U.S. Army, which was first organized in 1866 after the Civil War. There were actually 6 black or colored troops that was organized at that time, authorized by Congress, 2 cavalry, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and 4 infantry divisions. And I was assigned to the 9th.
And today, being in the 1880s, tell us where you're located.
Where I'm located in Fort Davis, that's in Texas, and we do various patrols of that area. Of course, we were protecting settlers, mail runs, telegraph wires, the roads, and that sort of thing.
And how many people are in your unit?
There's 120 in my unit.
And who do you report to?
I report to Colonel Hatch. He is the regiment, the troop commander, and I am from B Troop within the 9th Cavalry.
And take a few minutes, this is my final question, take a few minutes to tell us what a typical day might be like.
Well, a typical day starts at about 5 in the morning, and there's reveille, and then you get out and you take care of the horses first. Stable duties are first. And, your mount is the most important part of your equipment, and each trooper is assigned to a specific mount, and he lives and takes care of that mount and makes sure that he's well fed and groomed, everything in perfect condition and ready to go at a moment's time.
Charla.
Black Cavalry is something new in the 1880s. Can you talk a little bit about how they came to be part of the U.S. military?
Well, yes. They came to be after the Civil War. Now, you know there were 180,000 colored troops. The 54th Regiment out of Massachusetts was first. And we fought the Civil War against the South. And after the war, we had maybe 160,000 left. And they didn't know what to do. The government didn't know what to do with all of those colored troops that had been trained to fight and had arms and things. And at that time, the country was expanding westward, and there were problems. We were taking territories from the native people. And as we advanced to the west, they needed escorts. And I remember an officer saying, if Union troops are going to be killed by Indians, it might as well be colored ones. So they sent the 9th and the 10th Cavalry west, and they had the 10th Cavalry was at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and the 9th was at Fort Davis in Texas. And my regiment worked out of Texas, went through Arizona, New Mexico, back and forth across the border, the Mexican border. We did all sorts of things. We did border protection. We did police work in the towns and protected settlers. And also we protected the Indians too. We had some bad guys that were Indian agents, and they would misappropriate properties. So we were there to police them as well.
But when you talk about being in a black regiment in the military, there's a level of liberation that comes with this, especially from the history in the South. But being part of the military may have been slightly liberating, but could you talk a little bit about how your regiment might not be the same as the other regiments that we're going to see in the military?
Well, first of all, it's an all-black unit, with the exception of the officers. They were all white, and they were hand-picked. A lot of white officers that was assigned to our regiment refused to take duties and assignments, and a lot of them would take reduction in rank rather than to serve with a colored unit. And the ones that were assigned to us, they were they were good. They were faithful, and they trusted us, and they had confidence in us, especially Colonel Hatch and Colonel Garrison, Lieutenant Persian. They were all good officers, although it was hard being in an all-black unit. Sometimes we came in contact with white units, and there was friction. In the towns of Brownsville, Texas, there was friction because there was no place for us to go outside of the fort. And so there was problems. So we didn't have a good, we were liberated in one way, and then another way we were not. Because you remember, the Civil War had just been over a few years, a couple of decades. And that was a problem. So we still face a great amount of racism there. And therefore we became very close-knit. It was more like a family, a home. The 9th was a home for many of them because a lot of them were from slavery. And this was the only time that they had a group or a family sense that they'd been doing something they thought was worthwhile, although it was fighting our red brothers. And it was a duty and a job we had to do.
That you just brought up something. My last question I wanted to ask has to do with your red brothers. The relationship that you have with the people in your in the particular regiment that you're in is very special.
Yes.
But there's also a relationship that seems to have been built with the Indians, regardless of the fact that they are your enemies during many of the duties that you may have had.
Yes.
Could you talk about that relationship and also kind of integrate the buffalo?
Yes. Well, they weren't our enemy. They were enemies of the United States. And although we were freed and we were full citizenship, we had full citizenship at the end of the Civil War. And we chose to go into the Army because it was a way to get ahead. It was a way to earn money. And we had a career in the first time. And we went west and we fought the Indians, yes. But when a lot of us saw the Indians, especially the Cheyenne, the Apaches, and they were some of them as dark as us. And they were like kin. But we had to fight them, and we felt sorry for them. But at the same time, they respected us, and we respected them. And they gave us the name, which we wear today, Buffalo Soldiers. And because there is an animal that they revere much, much higher than anything else, and that's the buffalo. Mm-hmm. And because of the dark color of the buffalo, the dark pigmentation of our skin, and the texture of our hair, and the way we fought and rode horses, they gave us the name Buffalo Soldier. And we wore that badge with great honor. And they respected us, although they fought us. And I think they may have gotten a kick out of it sometimes. Mm-hmm. And we did too, because we played a lot of cat and mouse games running after them, like Victoria and Geronimo and a few others. So it was it was really an exciting time, but it was a hard time because there were a lot of lives that were lost on both sides. And this was a sad thing for myself, as a leader, and knowing that we had lost so many in the Civil War. Still people were being killed.
As we go back in time, we're sitting here in the 1880s. Obviously, slavery has ended with the great victory in the Civil War and the addition of the 13th Amendment. But in your time, in the 1880s, there certainly was segregation. And in the next decade, in 1896, even the High Court would say that segregation was not in violation of the Constitution. So you are in a unit where there is a lot of liberty within that organization, but once you leave the base, especially being in the South, you saw such segregation. And so I say all that to lead up to the heroes that you have been. There are things that you were asked to do as Buffalo Soldiers that you were great at what you did and had great success. And so my question is, those who were discriminated against you or pretending to be superior, which they weren't, but they couldn't do things that you could do. One, they were not bilingual, if you talk about that. And secondly, you, over time, even outside the 1880s, as you said, you really saved the back end of Teddy Roosevelt and Custer failed. So why don't you take us through those stories to show how gifted you were and how successful you were as Buffalo Soldiers?
Well, Custer didn't want the 9th Cavalry nor the 10th Cavalry to ride with him because of his racist views, and his statement was he didn't want any brunettes, referring to the darker people riding with him. His officers refused to command us, and so we were put back out on the outskirts. And when he went through the Little Bighorn, we could have saved him, but he chose not to. The same with Teddy Roosevelt, which we did save later on in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, when he took the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill. And they really didn't understand what they were doing. And it took the Buffalo Soldiers, the 9th and the 10th, that they had dismounted. We were ground troops then. And went up Kettle Hill and also San Juan and saved the Rough Riders and got them back to safety. Now, you got to remember go back a couple of years, and it wasn't until 1868 in Texas that the slaves knew, or the black people knew, that they were free. And by that time, we were already assigned, they had established the 9th and 10th Cavalry in 1866. So on June 19, in 1868, this is when the slaves of the black people found out they were free, and the Buffalo Soldiers brought that word to them. And today, in present time, we celebrate that day as more or less as a Independence Day, like we would celebrate the 4th of July, and it's called Juneteenth Day. As far as the segregation, on the base was the only place that we felt comfortable, because we had our white officers, they had their quarters, and we had our quarters. We had schools, the chaplains in most cases were black chaplains, which were officers, and they taught reading and writing, arithmetic, because many of the former slaves were uneducated, and even up until the 1880s, they just didn't have time. To go into town, into the small towns, it was a problem. You couldn't go into saloons. That was the only thing to do, actually go in a saloon. And there was a place in Brownsville, Texas, where a trooper went in town and he was killed. He went into a bar, and the white cowboys, the whites there, didn't think he belonged in there, and they killed him. And some of our troops from our unit went in, got their sidearms, and they shot up a bunch of people. And so we were restricted from going to town. It was more protecting us and the town people. But then the only time we would go into town, which we went in full honors dress and everything, we had a band. in the Ninth Cavalry. And Colonel Hatch procured the instruments and taught us all to play, and we entertained on Sundays. And that was the time when we were allowed to come in and was appreciated. And it seems all through history in this country, we blacks have been entertaining, and they really loved us. But then after that, then we went back to our own individual lives.
The other part of my question had to do with languages. And,
Yes.
and explain why so many members of your troop and all had advantage with different language. You had an easier time learning languages than the white people of your time.
Yes, we had an easier time with the language. It was easier because in Africa, when the countries is so, they overlapped and tribes overlapped, and you had to be multilingual and just to survive. And many Africans spoke as many as 5, maybe seven languages, and it was easy to pick up other foreign tongues as we came over, especially the Native Americans, and also Spanish. It was fairly easy, and we had a lot of people that came, was brought over, that went through Spain and through Italy, so Latin was fairly easy at that time. And so it was fairly, it was comfortable with us talking to, of course they also use sign language and pick up different sounds. And the Native Americans, I like to call them first people, they weren't really Americans. They trusted us more than they trusted the white man. And the white man used that to his advantage. And a lot of times we felt betrayed because we had to get in and talk and use the language and the signs. And so we got along well with them, with the Native Americans.
Just one comment and go back to the panel. It's just another illustration where prejudice makes no sense. Here you are so gifted in knowing lots of language, and those who were discriminated against you didn't have even the same ability with languages. So again, it shows the irrationality of judging people by such characteristics as the color of their skin. With that, we go to Erna.
And that segues perfectly into my question, so thank you. Sergeant Wilkie, because you guys are a black unit, you get the toughest assignments of the military that there is. They're sending you to the places that they don't want to go.
Oh, yes.
And tell us, because of that, how's the morale? Don't the men get disillusioned, disenfranchised, demoralized? How do you keep your spirits up?
Well, first of all, there's a kinship among the troopers, because they all have so much in common and their background, and we trusted one another. And myself as being a top soldier, top sergeant major, and they looked up to me. Now, you see, in slavery, they didn't have anyone to look up to other than one of the elders, but also a slave. They couldn't trust the house slaves, or they call them house niggers, because they figured they were in with the masters. And so, but the field hands in the slave quarters, they did. And we had this kind of relationship within our troops. And they relied on one another, and they made the job easier. And we were a team or a family, and more so than the white troops. We had less desertion among colored troops than the white troops. We had quite a few Medal of Honor winners because we took our job serious. We were dependable, and we would come back, and we didn't get drunk as much as the white troops. And so we entertained ourselves. We brought we did everything. Everything they took from slavery, they had brought here, we used that. From cooking to blacksmithing to entertaining, whatever, improvising and making life, because it was pretty rough. And talking about the jobs are tougher, not only were they tougher, we had the worst equipment. Our equipment was all from the Civil War. The horses were from the Civil War. They were worn out horses. Our equipment, it was worn equipment. And we made do as we did in slavery time. And we invented things and repaired things. So that kept us busy. And that was a kind of a pride that we had among ourselves. And we just took less and did more than anybody else because we were told by our elders that you had to be twice, 3 times better than the white man just to be average. We knew that, and we proved it.
If someone wants to join the 9th Cavalry, how would they do that?
If someone wants to join, well, there's always recruiting. And they're at recruiting offices, especially from the north. We had a lot of people in our unit from Cincinnati. We had a lot of people from Chicago and Massachusetts and New York. And so they would go into a recruiting office and join, because you see, this was a way of life. It was a job. It was a way to take care of families. And we were paid $13 a month. It was a lot of money back there in the 1800s. And so you would join, go to a recruiting office, and you would join, and they would send you out. And first, they would just join the Army. And it was by chance they were sent to a cavalry unit, because they had to fill the other infantry units as well.
And my last question, tell us how the food is.
Well, the food is on a scale of 1 to 10. It would go up and down that scale many times. In the field, the food was a 1, because mostly we had dry rations or cold rations, and that would be maybe tack, and that's hardtack, which is made of flour, and maybe lard and salt, and what was the other, jerky, things like this. And we had coffee that we would make, and most of the times we were in pursuit of Victoria or Geronimo. We had cold camps, so it was dangerous to make a fire. So you didn't have hot coffee, so you had water in your canteen and your hardtack. And once we got back to the fort, on special days, on Christmas and Thanksgiving, especially Christmas, our Colonel Hatch would get everything that he could possibly get from the town. I remember once a week we had turkey, chicken, we had a ham and a side of beef and all the trimmings and cakes and pies. And I think we had a little moonshine. They didn't call it moonshine there in those days, but it was a good day.
Great.
Charlotte.
You know, after being part of such a great movement, then looking out to the rest of the society as you move into the 1880s, 1890s, and into the turn of the century, you don't see as much progress perhaps taking place, especially with race relations during that time. But there are some people that stand out. You know, I think of Frederick Douglass and so forth. And could you talk about some of the movement that starts to take place, perhaps with the involvement of people that had participated in the military and then go out into society looking for something a little more?
Well, first of all, the military was the first place that, with the skills, I mean, the military is really, really a good place to be. It's too bad it involves war, but that's what it's about. It was a war machine. And you learn skills there that you can transfer into civilian life and use. And a lot of cavalry men, troopers, did this sort of thing when they left. And not all of them stayed for 20 years, and some left. You know, my uncle, I think, was only in about 7 years, and he was out in 1895. And I don't know what his job was. The records didn't show that. But let's say for blacksmithing, when you look at the turn of the century, we were still using horses and buggies and wagons and things, so that was a job, a skill. Cooking was another skill, and if a young man was fortunate enough to go into the surgery unit, hospital, that was another skill. Of course, in the office, being a clerk, being an orderly, that was a big skill. And you find a lot of black men and women early 1900s in the military. They went into supply and they went into clerks because they learned those skills, and also learned those skills from people like Colonel Allensworth, who was a chaplain. And so those skills were transferable into civilian life, and even in the Navy, those kinds of things, because we had steamships and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Great. That you mentioned women. I just wanted to ask one more quick question, little trivial question.
Okay.
First woman in the military.
The first woman in the military, I like to think, was a black female.
Yeah.
But she went in as a male, and that was Kathy Williams. And she switched her name around. She disguised herself as a man, and she called herself Bill Cassie. And she was discovered when she was wounded. I don't remember the exact place or the campaign she was wounded in, but the surgeon discovered that she was a female, and he was shocked that this black trooper, was indeed a woman.
Oh.
And she was, as far as I know, the first actual woman that was in combat in this country. And just happened to be a black woman.
Yep.
And nobody really talked that up and pointed it out. And it's a shame. And it shows how strong the people were in those days. I mean, a woman taking had that much courage to go, to make money and to prove herself.
Yeah.
It reminds me from your time in the 1880s to the 20th century, where women, when they would enter politics and all of those kind of things, they had to be much better at their efforts than men to break those barriers. And so it's been true of a lot of groups in our
Yes.
society. We're just almost out of time, and after your time, later there would be a stamp in honoring the Buffalo Soldiers, and I'm sure that would, knowing that, going back in your time, that would please you very much.
Yes, it would please me, as a U.S. stamp honoring the Buffalo Soldiers, and that came in 1992, and a good friend of mine, which is still alive, his name is Ernest Collier, and he was one of the soldiers there that he was honored and to receive that stamp. And so that was a great thing for us and for the country to see that.
That is wonderful. It's always an honor to have a stamp. It's a very special recognition. And on that note, we have to bring our program to conclusion. Sergeant Wilkie from the 1880s, thank you for being here in your role and telling us that history. Ladies and gentlemen, please be with us again next week, and we'll have Albert Wilkerson back as himself to talk about these issues. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.